Okay, we've already talked about how to solve quadratic and cubic equations. In 312, these are just the same types of equations, just mixed together. So you really need to pay attention to the type of problem that we've got here. So for example, on number 1, this is a quadratic. So we're going to be undoing the squaring by taking the square root of both sides. On number 3, this is a cubic. So we're going to be undoing the cube by taking the cube root of both sides. Again, we always want to simplify. We always want to make sure that we're isolating the radical term before we try and undo that square or cube or whatever it is. So here are the problems we're going to take a look at. Let's take a look at number 12. So we're going to slide down here and take a look at number 12. So on number 12, you'll notice that it's not isolated. It's not isolated, so we're going to subtract the 65 from both sides. Subtract 65. And this is definitely a calculator problem. A lot of these are. So we end up with, I'm going to pull up the calculator. And I'm going to go ahead and throw in there, and if you can figure this out in your head, that's awesome. I'm going to take 794 and I'm going to subtract 65. So let's see what we've got there. We've got 729. So I'm going to go ahead and write 729. And this is where it really becomes useful if you've memorized all of those perfect squares and perfect cubes that I mentioned. 729, that should ring a bell. Now, definitely the next step, everybody ought to know what that is. We want to undo the cubing, so we're going to take the cube root of both sides. And again, make sure you put the index in there. So the cube root undoes the cubing, so we get a y right here. Now remember, with a cube root, whatever the sign of the radicand is, whatever's underneath the radical, that's the sign of the answer. So this is a positive 729, so this is going to be a positive whatever the answer is. Now we're going to throw this in and just see what type of answer we get. So again, we're going to hit the math button. We're going to pick the fourth one down. There's the cube root. And we want to do the cube root of 729. Again, hop out from under there just for good practice. And we're going to hit enter. So that is 9 cubed. Okay, so we end up with a really nice answer on this one. We end up with a 9. And again, what that means is if we were to plug that right in there, it would make that a true equation. Okay, so we've got that one done. Now I want to take a look at number 15. Okay, we're on the back side with number 15, and you'll notice that this has a square on it. So this is a quadratic equation. So we're going to use the same type of technique. We're going to isolate that square right there. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to subtract 42 from both sides. So we'll subtract 42 from both sides. Those cancel each other out. Please don't forget the negative. So we've got negative x squared, and then on this side we've got to figure out what negative 282 minus 42 is. Now you might be able to figure that out in your head, but I'm going to grab the calculator. So I'm going to throw into the calculator negative 282 minus 42 and see what we get there. And we get negative 324. So negative 324. Now I'm hoping that that rings a bell there. So I'm going to leave that as it is right now. So you think about that for just a second and see if you can come up with what that is, because that should be a familiar number. Again, if you miss that negative on there, if you miss that negative 1 as a coefficient on the x squared, that's going to completely change the problem. So please make sure you're careful with that and keep those around. We're going to go ahead and divide both sides by negative 1, or you could just as well multiply by negative 1. Either way, we're going to get x squared equals 324. So we've got the x squared, the squared variable, completely isolated. Now we're going to undo the squaring by taking the square root. So we're going to take the square root of both sides. So we get an x on this side, and then this is at the point where I'm hoping that you recognize this. So it would be really nice if this were a perfect square. If you memorized that entire list that I gave you, you probably recognize it and know what the answer is. If you didn't memorize all of those, I'm hoping you at least have an idea. Yeah, 324, that looks pretty familiar. It wouldn't surprise me if this is a nice answer. So let's do this. We're going to take the square root. Okay, so second x squared of 324. And again, hop outside there. Make sure you're always outside there before you hit the enter sign, just for good practice. And we're going to hit enter, and we end up with an 18. So I'm going to put an 18 right here. Now, there is one thing I'm hoping that some bells went off and you recognize that I did not write something down that I should have immediately. So whenever we're solving a problem and we're taking the square root of both sides, when we put a square root in a problem, we have to account for the fact that we don't know whether that x was positive or negative. Because when you square a positive, you get a positive. When you square a negative, you get a negative. So please make sure that you immediately put that plus or minus there. So the right way to do this one would have been x squared equals 324. Take the square root of both sides. We'd put an x right here and immediately put a plus or minus before you find the square root on your calculator. Start simplifying that. That is a classic mistake. I even make that sometimes. It's very, very common for people to miss that. So I would hate for you to miss points on a test or on a quiz because you forgot to put the plus or minus on there. Again, it's not required on a cubic because those signs work out the way they are. But with a quadratic, when we're squaring things, we lose that sign when it's positive or negative. We get the same answer either way. So please make sure you're putting that square root sign on there before you write down the answer or look to simplify that radical in any way. All right, so the answer on that one is x equals plus or minus 18. That's very much like the assignment is. They're all mixed together. So keep an eye on those and make sure with the x squareds, when you're taking the square root, when you're putting a square root in the problem, that you put a plus or minus on there. Good luck.